Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Southpol Climate Chatter on building climate resilient supply chains. Today, we will hear from experts from Port of Amsterdam, AkzoNobel, and Southpol. This webinar is organized by Southpol in the Benelux and is part of the Southpol Climate Chatter series. With Climate Chatter, Southpol is offering a series of online events to understand, debate, and of course, inspire climate action. We hope that today you'll come out of this particular Climate Chatter with an understanding of how to evaluate and prioritize the climate impacts on your supply chain, how to engage your stakeholders and partners along your supply chain, and how to increase the resilience of your supply chain in challenging times like the ones we are currently experiencing. We know that this is a tall task to accomplish in just over an hour, and we will of course do our best to achieve it together with you. A few housekeeping rules before we start. We would like to make this session as interactive as possible. As attendees, you're all in listen-only mode during the whole webinar. If you do have a question or a comment, please use the questions function. If you have any technical difficulties at any time, please contact us directly. And for questions related to the presentations, we would like to refer you to the Q&A at the end of this webinar. We'd also like to thank you all for submitting questions ahead of this webinar, and we will try, of course, to answer those during the presentations. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent to you within the next week. Last but not least, as you can see, we are still all broadcasting from our homes, so please bear with us if there is any background noise, any children jumping into the screen, or any technical difficulties. We are really pleased to be joined today by a number of key experts in the field of resilient supply chains. First of all, Linda van Waveren, who is the Sustainability Manager at Port of Amsterdam, Rinske van Heinigen, who is the Director of Sustainability at AkzoNobel, Naomi Rosenthal, the Director of Sustainable Supply Chains at Southpol, and Charles Henderson, who is the Director of Corporate Climate Strategies at Southpol. Last but not least, my name is Ricardo de Carolis, and I'm the Regional Business Development Lead for Benelux at Southpol, based in Amsterdam, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this webinar today. So why are we actually here today? As part of our organization's emissions, the ones occurring within the value chain, referred to as Scope 3, oftentimes account for the biggest part of the greenhouse gas footprint. We have also seen that a number of recent global events have put a lot of stress on supply chains globally, and hence it is instrumental to ensure the resilience of those value chains. Our goal for today is to provide insights into solutions and best practices. Starting with Charlie, who will provide an overview on the topic of supply chain resilience. Rinske will continue by sharing insights on the new 3-pillar strategy at AkzoNobel. Linda will take us to a deep dive of the sustainable port vision and supply chain projects at Port of Amsterdam. And Naomi will round up our group of experts by highlighting examples how to engage stakeholders along their supply chain. After the speaker presentations, of course, we will have time for a Q&A together with the speakers. So before we officially start, and for those of you who don't know Southpol yet, we are a leading project developer and globally recognized advisor on climate action. We are present in 18 locations globally with a team of over 300 experts. We work with companies, investors, and the public sector along their climate journeys. And our solutions help reduce millions of tons of CO2 globally, develop clean technologies, build climate resilient supply chains, and improve living and working conditions for countless people. As for our presence in the Benelux, our team is based in Amsterdam and consists of 25 climate experts with a wide range of focus areas, such as climate strategy, renewable energy, and sustainable supply chains. Now that we finally have sorted all the administrative details, and without further ado, I would like to pass on the word to our expert speakers for today, starting with Charles Henderson. So Charlie, please switch on your camera, unmute yourself, and then the floor is yours.
Ricardo, thank you. I'm going to make a quick sort of context background introduction to supply chain resilience, particularly in light of the COVID-19 crisis. So Ricardo, I'm going to ask you to move my slides on if you may. So the pandemic, if it's proved to us anything, it's how reliant the global economy has been on just-in-time supply chains, as well as continued demand and supply and travel to promote economic growth. And in just a few short months, we've witnessed the rapid unraveling of the global movement of people and goods, with dire consequences for many industries. Now, the fact that the global patterns of trade and travel will change seems a given. How that's likely to play out is yet to be determined, and this is going to depend on many, many factors, including climate change. But encouragingly, in a poll of around 100 of the world's leading sustainability professionals, 97% said that their long-term sustainability strategy remains unchanged despite the pandemic and an economic crash that it may trigger. But this just underlines the urgent need to design smarter, stronger, and more diverse supply chains. And if you like, that's one of the main lessons of the crisis. Next slide, please. So the drivers of supply chain risk are myriad. So key examples include regulation, cyber attacks, raw material price hikes, geopolitics. And everyone knows the immense destruction that's caused by the geopolitical strife between, for example, the US and China. And, retaliatory trade tariffs upending supply chains are kind of a consequence of this. Now, climate change is equally, if not more important, as a driver of supply chain risk. And without a doubt, corporate climate resilience is more important than ever as a result of this. Building resilience into a supply chain is kind of you can see it as a battle on many fronts. And obvious measures to address this include diversifying and closer relationships with key suppliers, stock buffers, intelligence such as market research, better understanding of the culture of countries of supply, etc. And there's also softer approaches such as public affairs. The key really is awareness of risk vulnerabilities, and they're kind of the Achilles heels within your supply chain. And this can be used to address challenges internally. There are also many opportunities to gain competitive advantage, and a key element is realizing this advantage is through disclosure, for example, to investors. The next slide, please. Actually, just briefly, I'm going to run through a couple of key examples of supply chain climate risks. So in 2005, we had Hurricane Katrina. It was the most destructive storm in US history. Hard hit by the loss of suppliers was particularly the chemical industry. Sectors such as textiles and automotive parts and food packaging, which were heavily reliant on petroleum-based products. They were scrambling to find new suppliers as a result. Second example, the 2018 California wildfire. It was amongst the most destructive ever recorded. And it caused major disruptions due to road closures and smoke pollution. And that led to health risks for supply chain workers. Many warehouses in Northern California, fulfilling e-commerce orders for the big tech giants, they were closed, causing major delays. Third example is 2018. It was a year of drought in Europe, as many of us know, and that caused water levels in the Rhine to plummet. And as a result of that, there were disruptions in shipping along this vital waterway. These were very significant, and suppliers of key materials left the manufacturing industry in Germany without feedstock. And the chemical industry was particularly hit hard. We move on to the next slide. Great. So a fast-growing framework for considering this sort of myriad of climate change risks and disclosing them to investors is TCFD, which is a framework developed by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And as many of you will know, there's also growing alignment with other disclosure frameworks such as CDP and SASB. And over 1,000 businesses so far have committed to disclose through TCFD in their mainstream filings. And there are indications that it could become mandatory into the future. So investors are increasingly demanding, that this comes a compulsory filing. And in brief, the risks are broken down into the bottom left, physical risks, acute incidents like high impact events such as hurricanes and heavy precipitation, and chronic sort of slower moving incidents like heat wave, physical impacts such as heat waves and sea level rise. Then on the right, we've got the transition risks such as carbon pricing and reputation. Particularly relevant here as the emissions along the value chain typically make up about 80% of a company's greenhouse gas footprint. And in the EU, for example, there's consideration of consultation going on around the carbon border adjustment mechanism as part of the Green Deal, i.e. some sort of tariff system or some sort of financial mechanism at least. However, on the other side of the coin, above the line, if you like, on financial impacts, are the positive, the competitive advantage to be gained in the supply chain. More efficient suppliers means lower costs and carbon exposure. Higher resilience means less disruption to production. And innovation around materials and products means ultimately happier customers and the potential for new markets. We just move on. So at South Pole, we see climate action as a journey towards ultimately climate leadership. And we work with organizations at different stages of the journey, particularly related to supply chains here. We've developed, if you like, a supply chain journey. So if we take that step by step, starting at the left, step one includes a materiality assessment to identify what the major risks are. And then using scenarios to do physical and transition risk assessment as per TCFD that I just outlined. And then a scope 3 carbon footprint and potentially life cycle assessments to dive deeper into the carbon emissions for a particular product or service. Step 2 includes setting targets and roadmaps, which would then set up for a science-based approach, for example. And then also that would include the engagement of tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. Step 3 in the middle includes energy and renewable energy programs, for example. Step 4 includes carbon insetting as an example, financing climate action. And then step 5 involves expanding the reach to other stakeholders such as partners and even competitors where there are shared interests at stake. And then the next slide, please. So here's a practical example of how we're helping a client. It's a tech company. The drought assessments that we've undertaken are against 2 different time frames, and this has allowed the company to assess the relative change in the hazard. And when combined with the vulnerability of the assets, this allows the impact on the data centers and retail centers, etc., to be interrogated. We've put this model into Tableau, and that allows the dashboard to be kind of stress tested in terms of timeframes and different warming scenarios and different temperatures and so on. And similar modeling can be undertaken for carbon pricing and other risks under the TCFD framework. And then ultimately, the client can use this for the trends and the projections for each risk to, can get a report, and they can use this in a workshop setting to explore the risk further. So in summary, we see this year, 2020, as a pivotal moment in our re-examining of supply chain risks and opportunities. Climate change is one of the key factors at play with the potential for disruption at the scale of COVID-19. And now we're going to hear about some practical case studies and approaches which can be used to gain competitive advantage and ensure a business is resilient. So thank you, and I'll now pass back over to Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for sharing with us the main risks and opportunities, and obviously also how to use scenario assessments to increase your supply chain resilience. Next up in the speaker list is Rinske van Heiningen from AkzoNobel. So Rinske, I see you already switched on your camera, so I will now pass on the words to you.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. My name is Rinske van Heiningen, Director of Sustainability for AkzoNobel. And I would like to talk a little bit more about our new sustainability strategy, People, Planet, Paint, and how we try to make a positive impact in our supply chain, in our value chain, to reduce our carbon footprint overall. So can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so first, a very short introduction. AkzoNobel, you might know AkzoNobel. It used to be a chemicals and paints and coatings companies, but we divested the chemicals business last year, which means that a big part of our carbon footprint has also reduced because of that. And we are now a focused paints and coatings company with around 10 billion revenue and almost 35,000 employees and active all over the world in around 80 countries. Yeah, go to the next slide, please. So my challenge or my assignment was to develop a fit-for-purpose sustainability strategy for AkzoNobel. And there were also some changes in what I just mentioned in the footprint. And we really wanted also with the new CEO and a new executive committee also to make it a little bit more business-led. So we focused a lot on the environmental part of sustainability in the past with Planet Possible, and not so much on what we can do for our customers. So how could we make a positive impact through our products and services that we offer to society? And also, how do you make money with it? And the whole principle is that we just want to do the right thing. We have always been a leader in sustainability, and we want to continue to be the leader and also to be the reference and also set a good example, but really combine that also with the financial part of sustainability, because our belief is that if you really integrate it to the company and the businesses really start owning this, then you can make sustainability also happen on the long term. So it should not be something on the side. So we prefer to do small but impactful things and things that we can really deliver on, integrated in all the businesses, than big and bold ambitions that sometimes are very hard to achieve. Yeah, go to the next slide. So when we look at our portfolio, also with the focus on what we offer to society and how can we make that positive impact also in the carbon footprint, we checked in our full portfolio assessment, which was developed together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, how big our portfolio of sustainable solutions actually is that we can make an impact with through our products and services. And it appears, and we can also prove that around 40% of all our solutions have a sustainability benefit. And we also want to use that also in our future strategy, which we are now developing. Go to the next slide, please. So our new sustainability strategy covers 3 pillars: people, planet, that's the environmental ambition, scope 1 and 2, for the people who are aware of what it means. And then we have paint, and that's merely the scope 3 part of the ambition setting process. And today I only focus on planet and paint because people is a little bit out of scope when you talk about the carbon footprint in the supply chain. Go to the next slide, please. As a result of a long process, also this business ownership and the functional ownership. So my role is not to set the strategy. My role is to connect all the dots and drive all the functions and businesses to come up with their proposal and then conclude that in something like you see here in front of you. So this is the result of a bottom-up process, and we are sure that we can commit and deliver to all these ambitions, and that we have programs in place for the next 10 years to also be able to deliver on these ambitions. So the biggest one is really reducing our carbon footprint, our carbon emissions by 50% in 2030. And there are 2 more sub-targets to get there. The one is the 100% renewable electricity, and of course a substantial energy use reduction target to get there. And then you see towards a zero waste company. That's also part, of course, of circular, becoming more towards a circular economy. We have set the target of zero non-reusable waste in 2030. At the moment, 50% of our waste is already being reused or recycled. So we are already very well on track to get there. And then the other one is the 100% water reuse at our most water-intensive sites. Being a paints and coatings company, for example, the paint and the decorative paints, they contain a lot of water. And so they are produced at water-intensive sites. So the best way, also when you talk about resilience and the water scarcity that you see also becoming a bigger and bigger issue, we think we have a responsibility to also drive that and also take a responsibility there. So that's the ambition of that in 2030, we commit to reuse 100% of our wash water in our most water-intensive sites. In total, that is around 38 sites that are water-intensive in AkzoNobel. Yeah, go to the next slide. And when I said, well, it's about, of course, doing the right thing and setting ambitious and stretched targets, which are at the same time realistic and visible, that also you also then calculate what's the business case behind it. So we always work with a kind of business case calculation, and doesn't mean that we need to earn money with it, but also what's then the cost avoidance and the savings. Because in the end, sustainability is in many cases also a good deal. And that's what we try to show on this slide. In the past, we have set targets and ambitions, which delivered around 100 million, and also put us ahead of all our peers in our industry. So bringing really good results when you talk about environmental ambitions. And when you look to the future, you can see a similar amount of cost avoidance and savings. And that does not just happen overnight. To give you a little bit of a flavor, there are several thousand bigger and smaller projects in place in our company to drive this, so to really make it happen. So it's and that is also part of being ambitious. It means also that you need to have the capability and the ability to really integrate it into your operations. All the ambitions that I just presented are in line with the Paris Agreement and the most aggressive pathway of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And they all have a neutral to positive business case. And what I just said, they build on existing programs and best practices that we have developed so far in our company. Next slide, please. But that's just, of course, scope 1 and 2 that I talked about. But what about the emissions in the value chain? At the left side of the slide, you see how the spread is of our carbon footprint in the value chain. And then you see that our scope 1 and 2 is actually quite small when you compare what we buy and what we sell. And if you then take into account how many projects and what an effort is needed to reduce your carbon footprint there, you can imagine what an effort is needed to do a similar type of thing in your scope 3, in the scope 3 part of your emissions. Getting back to our portfolio and our 40% of sustainable solutions, we see an opportunity there to drive that further and lead the way also in the paints and coatings industry. And as you can see on the right side of this slide, our focus areas of our paints and coatings portfolio, as it currently is, but also all our innovations, so our full innovation portfolio, and our R&D budget is around 2.5% of our total revenue as a company. So you can imagine a lot of money budget is put in there, is to really drive this process of bringing more sustainable solutions to market. And the focus areas are really reducing energy and CO2 emissions, but also focused on circular economy topics and improved productivity. So you can imagine that if you have a powder coating and you apply that, you need quite a high temperature. And if you can reduce the temperature to cure a powder coating, you save energy and you also reduce your carbon footprint. So we're really looking towards those type of solutions that we already have but we want to do even more with that in the future. Yeah, go to the next slide. So that part was really talking about what we can do with our products. The other part that we want to, or that we are currently already working on, is value chain collaborations. Some of you may know the Paint the Future initiative. That's a big innovation initiative from AkzoNobel, the first in the paints and coatings industry, to really bring startups and large corporates like us together to solve sustainable and societal challenges today and in the future, and use the collective knowledge, because as a big company, you may know that you may think that you have all the answers, but the truth is you need to collaborate to find those answers and bring other and new solutions to market. So that's one part. The other part is that we really work together and also with our suppliers. And the Paint the Future also has a supplier initiative attached to it. So we brought around 40 suppliers, key suppliers together also to say, okay, we can always talk, it's difficult, it's too expensive. And yes, we want to improve our carbon emission in the value chain, but you need to start talking to each other and jointly find solutions to really make that difference and make that impact. Yeah, go to the next slide. And then we have this one. It's currently under debate in our company. What I mentioned before is that everything we do fits in the Science-Based Targets initiative and also in the Paris Agreement pathways. And then you could say, okay, let's commit to Science-Based Targets initiative, because then you show that you commit to the 15% reduction in your carbon footprint in the value chain. The only thing is we have a little bit a Calvinistic approach to sustainability. So when we commit to a target, we will deliver. And if we are not sure that we will deliver, or if there are too many interdependency of other stakeholders, then it's a little bit hard to commit to such a science-based target. So we are in the middle of debate. What can you be held accountable for as a company? Can you take on the responsibility of a full value chain if there are many more actors in that value chain? So that's a little bit perhaps something to open the debate later on in the discussion after the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rinske, for sharing these interesting insights on the ambitions of AkzoNobel in Scope 1 and 2, but also the challenges that you see in Scope 3, and especially when it comes to the science-based targets. Next up is Linda van Waveren, Sustainability Manager at Port of Amsterdam. Linda, I see your camera is already switched on, so I will now pass over the word.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. Everybody, I'm happy to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on how Port of Amsterdam is trying to build resilient supply chains as a logistic hub. I'm focusing on the sustainability risks in a broader sense than and not primarily on the climate risks. I'm Linda van Waveren. I'm the Sustainability Manager at Port of Amsterdam, and therefore responsible for the sustainability strategy and the development of the port's sustainability agenda. At first, I would like to tell you briefly something about Port of Amsterdam, followed by some characteristic sustainability challenges and the choices we have made to cope with them. I believe that those strategic choices are important building blocks for the way you contribute to make the supply chain more resilient. And lastly, I would like to give you a practical example of how risk can be transformed to business opportunity for the port. So the Port of Amsterdam is the fourth largest port in Europe. We are a public-private company, and on the public side, we are responsible for efficient, safe, and environmentally friendly handling of the maritime traffic. On the private side, we are developing the port region into an industrial hotspot, and we do the construction, maintenance, and of the physical infrastructure in the port area. Next slide, please. So I see three important sustainability challenges which impact our supply chains, and for all these we have made a strategic choice. So the first one is the energy transition. Around 70% of our turnover comes from handling fossil commodities as liquid bulk, like kerosene, and dry bulk like coal. For a few years, we have seen the coal volumes fall with around 25%. And since we want to accelerate in a low carbon transition by encouraging innovative startups and investing in clean energy, we have made a strategic choice to be coal-free by 2030. And I must say that was a very brave move from our board, which now has been seen by other boards as a great example. And the strategic choice we have made in this regard was, we made a statement as a business partner in the supply chain. So the second challenge for us has to do with globalization. The expanding city of Amsterdam leads to a battle on spatial planning and threatens our license to operate. But instead of resisting the interweaving of the city and the port, we more and more embrace each other and find benefit. So the city has been seen by the Port of Amsterdam as a giant waste supplier for our growing circular industries. And the port has been seen by the city as a battery for the city. So we say now it's not only the Port of Amsterdam, but it's also the Port for Amsterdam. And the strategic choice we have made in this regard was finding mutual benefits in your supply chain. The last challenge is that there is a growing attention for ethics, and not only by the city of Amsterdam, but also in Europe. You see a growing interest in international CSR. And for us, it leads to discussions with stakeholders about the sourcing of commodities which are entering the port, in example, soy, coal, cocoa. And as a port, we are only indirectly linked to the supply chain, and we have little leverage to make fundamental changes. But we experience our responsible business conduct as an important element. So therefore, we have taken the lead in the international port sector to examine how we can influence supply chains. And the choice we have made into this challenge was that even if you have a small degree of influence, it shouldn't be decisive for taking responsibility. And from this point, I would like to take you briefly through an example of our CSR agenda. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the way we try to positively influence the supply chain. And what I already said, being a port, it makes it quite difficult. We are indirectly linked to supply chains or to commodity supply chains. Sometimes we are just a logistic spot where commodities are being handled and are passing through. But sometimes we are a little bit less indirectly linked because the industry in the port is processing the commodity. But in any case, sometimes, and even as a sustainability manager, you wish to have a little bit more leverage. But we do our best, and according to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and responsible business conduct, which we apply, we have made a CSR analysis for all our commodities which are being handled in the port. And we looked at the sourcing risks and along the supply chain, but we also looked at how we could contribute and positively influence each of the specific supply chain. And together with that, we also prioritize them to divide our resources. So this resulted into a specific engagement approach for each supply chain. And one of our focus commodities is cocoa, and it was needed to engage and strengthen the relationship between the commercial parties in the Amsterdam Zaanstad cocoa cluster, together with the government, the NGOs, and the financial institutions, but also with our Port of Amsterdam International division. And we had to do that while respecting all positions and sensitivities of these partners. For that reason, we organized a mission to Ghana and Ivory Coast with all parties represented, as you can see. And one of the goals was to get a mutual understanding of the specific CSR issues in the Amsterdam West Africa chain and learn more on how we could enforce traceability. Well, this mission resulted in strong relationships between the supply chain partners, which led to more mutual understanding and a joint effort to collaborate and make the cocoa chain more resilient. And together with this, Port of Amsterdam also developed a new project with the port management of Abidjan to help them building a sustainability strategy. And we are involved in the multi-stakeholder initiative DISCO, that's the Dutch Initiative for Sustainable Cocoa. Well, I think that this is a nice example of how important it is to connect supply chain partners and reinforce their relationships in order to create a positive impact. And that role suits us as a port because, yeah, we are connectors. We are connecting logistics and businesses, and for that reason, engaging and bringing parties together is a natural fit. So we are connecting for improvement. Well, with this, I would like to give the floor back to Ricardo, and please don't hesitate to contact me or even afterwards the webinar for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for sharing these interesting insights and especially the vision of the sustainable port. And from now on, I will be calling the port for Amsterdam and no longer the port of Amsterdam. Thanks a lot, Linda. Next up is Naomi Rosenthal, and Naomi will tell us a little bit more about the supply chain engagement opportunities, also with a concrete example. So Naomi, the floor is yours from here.
Thanks, Ricardo, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Naomi Rosenthal, and I'm leading South Pole's engagements on sustainable supply chains together with our team of experts. Next slide, please. So for a lot of the companies that we work with, when they begin to engage in sustainable supply chains, the question always comes, where do I begin? And that is a very difficult question sometimes, especially when we consider the complexity of having so many different raw materials, so many different geographies to be sourcing from. And that's not even to touch on the politics that can happen within a company, but also within the context of supplier relationships. We normally focus in on 4 key steps in order to set priorities. So that's really understanding the footprint and the risks, evaluating options and the impact potential. So on the left-hand side, you see a small graphic of a project that we've done where we've looked at the baseline footprint for a specific commodity and then evaluated what are the different options for reducing emissions in that context and identifying the right solutions in order to get towards a target. We also analyzed costs. So for each of those different solutions, it's not just about what is the impact potential, but what would it cost to get there? What would it cost to implement it, especially at scale? And on the right-hand side, you see an analysis that we've done actually for the cocoa supply chain. So it's an interesting link to the presentation we've just heard from the Port of Amsterdam that looks at how can, on-farm activities and landscape scale activities be used to reduce emissions and achieve, environmental targets. And with this information, so the impact potential as well as the costs, we can begin to set targets and a strategy by putting these all together. Next slide, please, Ricardo. But then comes the task of actually implementing it. So once you've developed, a strategy and priorities, how do you actually work with supply chain partners to make that happen? And we often say that it's about building a variety of different engagement approaches that work dependent on the industry, the company, and the suppliers. And it's important to be clever about combining those in the right moments and at the right time. We often think about 2 different axes. So the first one is about carrot and stick approaches. So on the carrot side, it's about setting supplier incentives, doing good offtake agreements, making sure to engage on co-funding. But on the stick side, we would want to make sure to have good supplier standards, minimum requirements, preferred sourcing regions, and be very clear on the red lines. But it's also important to think about the scale of the projects and programs. So sometimes it's important to have very specific and tailorized projects that really look at a specific value chain in a specific geography. But sometimes it's also better to look at industry approaches and think about engaging across the supply chain, with multiple different partners on a broader industry level engagement. So from the next slide on, I would like to present a quick case study on a concrete project that we've been working on cotton in China. So China is a very dry and arid place in the area where the cotton is being sourced. So this is in Western China. So even though that it's very dry and arid, it's also an incredibly important sourcing area for industrial scale cotton. Next slide, please. And despite its importance, or perhaps because of its importance, this landscape is also facing numerous significant environmental challenges. The primary challenges related to cotton emission or cotton production is really around the carbon emissions, as well as the negative impacts on soil, water bodies, and biodiversity. So when we looked at this challenge together with Caring and Rare, our partners on this project, we analyzed a number of different solutions, and we eventually zoomed in on two particular solutions around composting and windbreaks, which in combination also enable farmers to reduce their chemical inputs. Thankfully, this also helps to actually build resilience. So it lowers water consumption, it improves soil quality, and it enhances biodiversity. So I'd like to take you in on a few of the details of this project. Next slide, please. When we think about the benefits that these interventions provide, it's important to take quite a holistic view. So we often think about this holistic view as providing benefits across resilience, impacts, and the farmer business model. So the composting, for example, it increases resilience by increasing soil organic matter and the moisture levels in the soil. It improves the impact, the environmental impact, by actually reducing emissions related to the natural decomposition of the waste materials, but also the reduction in the use of chemical fertilizer. And chemical fertilizer, through its production process as well as the application, actually is very emissions intensive. But from a farmer perspective, the farmer business model is also enhanced because there's a reduction in costs for the farmers because they have lower input costs for chemical fertilizers and also lower pumping costs for the irrigation. On the windbreak side, we have a similar phenomenon where we look at resilience, impact, and the farmer business model, all of which are enhanced. So a reduction in winds from the windbreaks actually increases soil fertility by reducing soil erosion. We have an enhancement of carbon sequestration, so the trees basically sequester carbon directly. And we can, on the farmer business model side, see that it's improving cotton yields, and in some cases even generates additional income where these trees might be fruit trees or be able to be used for other income generating purposes. Next slide, please. Ultimately, it's important to always build an engagement model that kind of works and is fit for purpose. So in this example that I've just shared on the side for cotton in China, Caring can use those benefits in order to attribute towards their science-based target, climate neutrality, and build resilience. But to get there, they really need to work strategically. And so a number of tips that we give companies whenever engaging in the supply chain is to focus on building long-term partnerships, being really clear on the business model for suppliers and making sure that those incentives are aligned in order to develop ownership with suppliers so that they become true partners in implementing the project. And having a very strategic approach to the expectations, providing technical support, and tracking the progress. So all those technical elements are also necessary in order to achieve a good outcome. And finally, maybe from my side, just a personal tip for any company that's engaging in the supply chain. I would always advise to work with humility, integrity, and an entrepreneurial spirit, because at the end of the day, this is a new and unprecedented challenge we're facing, and this can be your impact to address that challenge. And so we would like to encourage and inspire anyone who's considering to take action in the supply chain, not to be daunted by the task, but inspired by the potential outcome. Thanks, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for taking us on this inspiring journey and sharing this inspiring story with us. Before we go over to the Q&A session, I would just quickly like to summarize the main takeaways from the presentation so far. So to start with, Charlie took us on a journey to highlight the main supply chain risks and opportunities. Then Rinske shared with us the ambitions and strategies around scope 1, 2, and 3 at AkzoNobel. Linda enlightened us with the leadership vision for Amsterdam as considering its role in various supply chain. And in the end, Naomi highlighted a very concrete example for climate action in the cotton supply chain. We now have some time, a good 15 minutes for Q&A with our speakers. Therefore, I would like all our speakers to switch on their cameras and unmute yourselves so that we can have an interactive discussion. And I will then also go over to the questions. Okay. So. Good. So we maybe start with some of the questions that we received before the webinar, and then go over to some of the questions that have been facilitated through the chat. If I may start, Rinske, with you. So there is one question quite relevant for you, I think, which is coming from a person from Yes Bank, corporate relationship manager at Yes Bank, and the question is how to strike a balance between maintaining supply chain profitability and at the same time decarbonizing the supply chain. So kind of like, where's the balance between profitability and decarbonization? I think you're muted. I can unmute you here.
Oh, sorry, I was not unmuted.
Yeah.
So we get that's always a dilemma to keep that balance, and sometimes you decide to do more, and sometimes so there's always so we work closely with suppliers. We make a selection of the biggest volume suppliers, the biggest value and volume suppliers, and how we want to work with them. So we're already working closely with them. Do we need to change? Can we reduce the cost? Can we find a collaboration in innovating and finding a new alternative for a product that we use? So you do many different things, but you can imagine that when COVID arrives, sometimes that really impacts your strategy or your ambitions. And because we also set the ambition for 50% recycled content in all our packaging, and we also make the carbon footprint calculation. And now you hear all over the place that recycled plastic is more expensive than fossil. And if companies are under pressure to make a financial performance, then you need to stick. So then you also need to do the right thing in that respect. And we committed to that, so we continue to do that. But I can imagine if you don't make that type of commitments or a little bit loose commitments, then you can be tempted to do different things because you also have other interests as a company. So what we do with supply chain is we have strong collaborations in our supply chain with suppliers. We select them. We do audits with suppliers. We also ask them to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they get like a preferred treatment when they deliver when they get to a certain point level in sustainability. And that's also what we do with EcoVadis. And you also have Together for Sustainability. We were one of the founding fathers of that initiative to really drive sustainability through the value chain. But it's not, having said that, then still, it's not easy. And you always have to ask yourself that question. So that's also for me and also my team members, a constant dialogue to keep it on the table and to address those dilemmas in the company. Yeah?
Thanks, Rinske. Yeah, I think that's a really good answer to this, I think, also a little bit complex question, and it's really a dilemma that I think a lot of organizations are facing. Maybe a good question also for Linda, which was sent to us by the impact manager of a company called Umeco, which is interested how to team up with your partners in your supply chain on scope 3 emissions, especially when you're small to them, but they're big for you. I think for the Port for Amsterdam, it's different. So kind of like you are the big player, and then the stakeholders are rather the small players. So how did you successfully, organize the dialogue with those stakeholders? What was the recipe for success there?
I think, yeah, we really invest in stakeholder management and also investing in to build on the relationship with our customers, and to get this thing going. I think that is the recipe, just to make resources free and start a dialogue with the customers, and then you dive into the logistic chain. And at the same time, we also have like big relationships with the local, regional, and national government. And we start to, we are really involved in all these multi-stakeholder initiatives. So that is, it takes some time, but it pays off.
Maybe Naomi, having also experience with the engagement, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, you shared with us some success factors, but maybe something as like a complete story comes to mind here as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that notion that you as a purchasing company are small in the context of of some of these suppliers is actually something that strangely even very large companies have. So I had a representative from a major food company recently mention, well, we're very small for this supplier, so we're never going to get them to change. So I think that never underestimate the reality of the situation, which is that one small purchaser can make a big difference. But then perhaps also opening up to to really understand what is actually the change that you are looking for, and what other partners might be interested in a similar kind of change, and maybe partnering up with them.
Cool. Very, very, very interesting.
To add maybe to that, Naomi?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
That's also what we try to do in the supply chain supplier initiative with Paint the Future, to really bring 40 suppliers together. And they normally never meet because they are competing with each other, and put a challenge in front of them and say, well, perhaps we need to collaborate to solve that challenge. And that's making those steps to do different things. If you want to change, you need to do things differently.
Maybe Charlie, both Rinske and Linda highlighted a little bit in their presentations. I mean, how much responsibility should you take, for supply chain action with your partners in the supply chain? Can you share some insights on that? I mean, how far should an organization go in taking responsibility for actors in their supply chain?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question, really. It's a very important one, because
I'm listening.
Yes, literally. To meet science-based targets, for example, businesses have to understand their scope 3 emissions, create good inventories, and then reduce in line with what science dictates. So I think that that pressure or the responsibility is increasing as a result of that. And then also there are all the systemic risks that I touched on, for example, as looked at through the TCFD framework. They play out through the supply chain too. So I think increasingly businesses are trying to understand those supply chain risks. And to give you an example, we're working with a construction company in the US that is a manufacturer, and increasingly they are looking at both the carbon impact and then also the water consumption and ultimately the materials that go into their products. And they're opening those conversations with their clients, and they're quite new to the climate leadership journey, but already they're recognizing this is something that needs to be tackled over the next few years.
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, so that's taking responsibility. Yeah.
For us, the next step for us is to integrate sustainability in our lease contracts with our customers. So that would be another opener for the conversation.
Yeah. To really include it into leases and contracting work as well. Yeah. That's an interesting approach as well. Linda, I see another interesting question, maybe for you, where it goes a little bit around the topic of are resilient supply chains the same as resilient communities? I mean, considering the work you do with the ports in Africa as well, do you see any positive impacts on the communities there as well, based on the work you do on the supply chain side?
So we actually focus on two things, and that is to engage with our customers. And the other thing is we have a division at Port of Amsterdam International, and actually they work more on capacity building of the port management in Africa, because that is a natural fit. We can help them to build a sustainability strategy and also to make the logistics more efficient. But it still is for us in our position so difficult to really directly impact on local communities. That has to come from like the big traders, and which we are trying to influence, because then we are like small and there is a big corporate company. But yeah, we hope that those little small nudges will convince them to make more resilient supply chains.
Interesting. We also have a question, and I think this is open to all the speakers. Maybe from a corporate side, Rinske, you could start on this one. How do you see the topic of competitive advantage by taking supply chain action? I mean, how strongly is it connected? And if it's connected, what does it mean for AkzoNobel as well?
If you do it intelligently, so many hurdles now in reducing carbon footprint or creating changes in the value chain or becoming more sustainable, whether it's carbon or more safe materials or whatever, because there's also discussions going on hazardous materials. It mainly struggles on the financial part. So there's a lot of discussion on you win, I lose. That's the traditional approach. Yeah? Some win, some lose. And how can we transform that into win? I win and you win. We all win. And also future generations win. So there's a lot of discussion going on also at the European level, also quite some years ago, in some of these innovation partnerships on what's the golden nugget of the business model. So if you can take an initiative there and take responsibility and bring partners together and learn jointly, and you are one of the first movers to showing that willingness and eagerness to learn and do things differently, then it can bring you also that competitive advantage. If you know how it works, you can use it and you can drive the change. So that gives you really a competitive advantage. Yeah, the other thing that, of course, is we see sustainability as a competitive advantage overall, and you need to drive that. And then you can also look at it from a economic perspective. But that, I don't think that's part of the discussion of today, because then you come in all types of other conversations. But we see it as a potential competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Linda, how is it for the big transportation hubs? I mean, ports, airports. How do you see the topic there of competitive advantage?
Well, when it comes to innovation, I think there is still some competitive advantage. And there's a big competition, because actually you want to create in a port or in a geographical area, you want to create some industrial symbiosis. And therefore you need some waste flows sometimes. So these competitiveness is really big. But from a CSR risk perspective, actually we work closely together with all the Dutch seaports in order to apply the OECD guidelines. So from that perspective, yeah, there is a level playing field.
Good. I think this is also a really positive note to end this really short Q&A question. Of course, to all the attendees, if you have more questions, we have been facilitating them through the chats, and we will of course also try to get back to you by email on those questions. So what remains to say now is basically thank you very much for joining us today for such a great discussion. Also thank you to all the speakers for sharing your insights and sharing also your thoughts on the Q&A session. Even though we've run out of time today, we still want to continue the conversation. We have a series of climate chatters coming up, which you can see here on the screen. And you can also visit the Climate Chatter website to find out more about that. So with that being said, we wish you a really nice day. Thank you for joining, and see you soon again. Goodbye.